What kind of power does it take to erase someone's identity? And what kind of strength does it take to reclaim it? In the twisted heart of ancient Rome, Emperor Nero did the unthinkable. After the death of his wife, he found a boy who resembled her and castrated him to become her replacement. Dressed in silks, paraded as a bride, and forced to live as a living ghost. This boy, Sporus, was consumed by one man's madness and an empire's silence. But this is not just a story of cruelty. It's a story of survival. Of a boy who lost everything, then slowly, painfully, found his voice and used it to carve a new identity from the ruins of his stolen life. This is Sporus, the boy who was never meant to survive and the writer who refused to be forgotten. The sound of soft sandals and stifled sobs echoed off the marble floors of the Palatine Palace. The light from the torches flickered on the gold-plated walls, making strange shadows of Rome's most powerful men. The smell of incense, wine, and the sour smell of too much power filled the air. Emperor Nero sat in the middle of this decadence, his eyes heavy with grief and madness. He held a golden goblet of Falernian wine that shook a little in his hand. Poppaea, Sabina, was no longer there. People who knew her death was coming talked about it in. It was as brutal as it was sudden. Some people said that Nero hit her in a fit of rage. Some people said it was a fever. The official statement was unclear and full of lies and flattery. Nero didn't care about any of it though. What mattered was that she was gone. She wasn't lying next to him in the marble bath anymore, and she wasn't calling him my son anymore. He had watched her face every day, memorizing the curve of her jaw, the way her skin shone in the moonlight, and the sound of her voice. Now that beauty had turned to dust in the royal tomb. But one day, while he was wandering through the imperial gardens by himself, Nero stopped by a fountain that looked like a lion's head. A group of servants went by, whispering and laughing like sparrows. One of them, a thin boy who looked to be about 14, turned his head. The emperor's breath stopped. The resemblance was scary. Cheekbones that are high, light skin. A full lower lip that shook a little when looked at closely. Nero moved closer, never taking his eyes off the boy's face. The young man stiffened and bowed, looking down. "What's your name?" Nero asked in a low voice. "Lord Sporus." The name sounded strange and ugly to Nero, but that face Poppaea's ghost seemed to move across it like water. He looked at his chamberlain. "Bring him to me." The boy was called that night. He stood nervously under the tall columns of the emperor's private rooms, wearing a tunic that was too long for him. His hands shook at his sides. Sporus flinched when Nero came close, but then he made himself stay still. "You remind me of someone I loved very much," Nero whispered as he stepped behind him. There was no answer. With 2 fingers, Nero pushed Sporus's chin up. "That could be you." The silence that came after was like tight silk. Sporus, who grew up in the shadows of imperial Rome, knew what happened when you disobeyed. He didn't say anything. Nero grinned. Plans were made in just a few days. The villa on the edge of Antium, surrounded by cypress trees and silence, became the setting for a strange change. It was clear what to do. The boy was to be taken to the doctor, gelded, changed, perfected. Sporus didn't cry when they held him down. Not during the process. Not while it was healing. Not even when they started making Poppaea's dresses fit him, by changing the waistlines to fit his boyish frame. He had learned to be quiet when he was young. It was better than yelling. While stylists curled his dark hair into complicated coils, he sat there with glazed eyes. He had to deal with the cold feel of powder and rouge on his cheeks. When Nero came to see him, he stood tall and still, like a statue in front of its creator. Nero whispered, "You are beautiful," as she was, and then he gave him a kiss. Senators in the forum whispered about going crazy. Of a boy who became a bride. Of a ceremony in which Nero, dressed as a groom, put a veil on Sporus's head and called him Sabina in front of the gods. There were musicians there, clapping, The petals smelled good and floated in the air. Sporus walked slowly down the aisle like a lamb dressed in pearls, and people laughed. That night, the imperial bedroom was completely quiet. Sporus lay next to the most powerful man in Rome, and his thin body barely made a dent in the silk sheets. Moonlight came in through the carved window lattice and made patterns on the bed. Nero's arm was wrapped around him possessively, and he was breathing heavily from wine and pleasure. Sporus looked up at the ceiling. He had given up trying to figure things out a long time ago. His world had fallen apart and then come back together as a dead woman. The boy he used to be had gone to a quiet place inside him where he couldn't be reached. What had once been anger, fear, and shame had turned into something fragile and resigned. He didn't shed a tear, not anymore. The next morning, Rome woke up to a scandal. Sporus, who is now known as Sabina in imperial court documents, was carried through the streets in a golden litter while wearing the clothes of an empress. People lined the streets to stare. Some laughed, some looked away in discomfort, but no one was brave enough to say anything. Nero, on the other hand, was glowing. He told his courtiers, "The gods have given her back to me," and he raised Sporus's hand like a winning athlete. "She is alive again." Sporus didn't say anything, but to the powerful people in Rome, something had broken. Seneca had long since cut ties with him. Burrus was no longer alive. Tosilinus, the always practical Praetorian prefect, kept his face blank, but he looked back and forth between Sporus and the emperor with a cold, calculating look. Nero's craziness got worse inside the palace. He put on plays in which he played Orpheus going down to Hades to get his beloved Eurydice, who was of course played by Sporus. The boy wore sheer white robes and was led onto the stage in gold chains. His eyes were empty, and he spoke in a whispery falsetto. The audience, which included senators and generals, clapped on cue. No one dared to show their disapproval. Doing so meant risking exile, or even worse. Sporus started to understand his role better when no one was looking. It wasn't just that he looked like Poppaea. He was her reborn, retold, a real-life illusion to fill the hole in Nero's grief-ridden mind. But sometimes, late at night, he would stand in front of a polished bronze mirror and look at the face that wasn't quite his anymore. The lips painted, the eyes lined with kohl, and the fake softness added by court makeup. He would touch his chest, which was flat under the silk, and feel a strange mix of numbness and confusion grow in his stomach. He whispered, "Who am I?" Once, not expecting an answer, Nero moved behind him. "You are my wife." As the months went by, rumors of rebellion spread across the empire like storm clouds. Galba in Spain, Vindex in France. Whispers between the legions. Rome was falling apart at the edges because it had been too long filled with decadence and Nero's artistic obsessions. Nero didn't seem to care though, inside the palace walls. He played the lyre. He read poetry out loud to Sporus, who sat still and listened. He wrote an ode called Sabina Reborn for the boy who slept in his bed. The first message came during a banquet in Naples. Vindex had started a rebellion. Nero's tunic got wine on it. When he got back to Rome, the empire was slipping through his fingers like sand. The Senate was behind Galba. The Praetorians were on edge. One by one, Nero's friends turned against him. Sporus stayed by his side through it all though, not by choice. But there was no other place to go. There was no more music echoing off the walls of the Domus Aurea. The garlands, shows, and nights filled with sweet wine and candlelight were all gone. The golden halls that used to impress foreign leaders now seemed empty, haunted by the sounds of footsteps that would never return. Nero sat in his private room with his back hunched and his eyes hollow. Ink stained his fingers. He got letters faster than he could read them. One after the other, they all told the same bad news. Provinces were leaving. Allies were leaving him, and the Senate was calling him an enemy of the state. The last straw was like a slap in the face. His own guards, the Praetorian Guard, had turned against him. The same men who used to kneel in front of him now bowed to Galba. He looked up at Sporus, who was standing quietly in the corner of the room, wearing a thin stola that hung off his small frame. It was impossible to read the boy's eyes. Nero said in a shaky voice, "I gave them everything. Plays, bread, gold, Rome itself. And they turn on me." Sporus didn't say anything. "You still believe in me, right?" Nero's eyes quickly moved to him. "Please tell me it wasn't all for nothing. A break." Sporus opened his mouth, then it was shut. He finally said, "I'm tired," in a low, careful voice. It was the most honest thing they had said to each other in months. They left the city 2 days later. Nero wore a tunic that was dirty and had a ripped hem to hide his identity. He only had a few loyal freedmen with him, and Sporus rode next to him in silence. Rome faded away behind them like a dream that turned into a nightmare. People traveling along the Via Salaria didn't even know who the fallen emperor was. Or even worse, they did and turned away. They found safety in the crumbling villa of Fiene, a former slave who became a steward. The emperor of Rome, who used to be very powerful, was now hiding in a cellar that smelled like mold and rot. His face was thin and his hands shook. He wouldn't eat. He slept in short bursts, waking up suddenly and mumbling lines from his old tragedies. He would sometimes hold Sporus' arm in the dark and whisper her name Poppaea over and over until she pulled away. They heard right away that the Senate had given them the death penalty. If caught, Nero would be stripped naked, chained up and beaten to death in the Forum. He wouldn't let it happen. Nero growled, "They won't show me off like a slave. I am the last of the eerily." He looked at Sporus, who was sitting quietly against the wall with his legs crossed under his robe. "Would you miss me?" he asked. Sporus didn't say anything. Nero moved closer, his voice hoarse. Would you help me?" The boy raised his head. The light from the candle flickered on his face. "How?" Nero grabbed the knife that was on the table. The blade was dull, but it would work. Nero said, "You were my wife. Now you will be Epineus, the faithful one, the person who killed Orpheus." The boy's hands were tight. He couldn't breathe. "I'm not able to," he said quietly. Nero didn't say anything. He took the knife and put it against his throat. But he couldn't do it. His hands shook a lot. He looked at Sporus with wide eyes and a look of desperation. "Please help me." Sporus's eyes filled with tears. He stepped forward slowly and quietly. The sound of the blade going through flesh was quiet, almost silent. Nero took a sharp breath that gurgled halfway through. Then he fell down. The emperor was already gone when the soldiers got there a few minutes later. They found Sporus kneeling next to the body, with blood on his hands and eyes that were empty and far away. The soldiers didn't say anything. They stood there in silence for a long time, looking down at the emperor's pale body, which was frozen in mid-gasp with wide, unseeing eyes. One of them, an older centurion with a face that looked like it had seen a lot of weather, stepped forward, knelt, and put 2 fingers on Nero's neck. He took them back just as quickly. "He's dead." There were no orders, no shouts of victory. Just a quiet nod between the men and the slow sheathing of blades. They looked at Sporus. He hadn't moved. The dagger was on the ground next to him, covered in blood. He couldn't take his eyes off the body. Not with sadness, not even a little bit of relief. Nothing but emptiness. It was like something inside him had been cleaned out. One of the soldiers said, "Take the boy," but softly. 2 men walked up to him slowly, expecting him to fight back or be scared or something. But Sporus was on his own. He let them take him by the arms and lead him barefoot across the villa's dirt floor. He said, "Sabina," in a low voice when they asked his name. They didn't ask about it. The next few months went by in a blur. Sporus was not put to death. Strangely, he was safe. Galba, who was now the emperor, thought the boy was more interesting than dangerous. He was given to one elite after another, like a ceremonial object. First, Galba kept him in the palace for a while, and then Nymphidius Sabinus, A power-hungry Praetorian prefect who wanted to be emperor himself got him. Nymphidius showed Sporus off to the guards as a sign of legitimacy. He put him in empress's robes, called him Augusta, and said he would marry him to make his rule stronger. Rome had seen a lot of strange things, but even the tired senators were shocked by this. He's going to marry Nero's ghost, someone laughed. How poetic. Sporus, on the other hand, gave in. His life had not been his own for a long time. He bowed when they called him empress. He did what they asked and put him next to another man who was pretending to love him. His voice stayed soft. His eyes were far away. He didn't think anything else would happen. But then Nymphidius was killed when his own guards suddenly turned on him and tore him apart. In the middle of the chaos, Sporus was left behind. A survivor who always survives. Then Otho came. Then there was Vitellius. After that, Vespasian. One emperor died, another one rose. And yet, Sporus moved from house to house like a living relic, a ghost of a crazy reign that no one wanted to talk about for long. People who remembered Nero would look at him with both interest and fear. He was the boy who had the name of a dead woman, the person who married an emperor and helped him die. Sporus was alone in a guest villa, far from the palaces in Rome, during the last days of Vitellius's short reign. The attendants were busy with the fall of yet another government. People stopped paying close attention to him. One morning, when the sun broke through the fog over the hills, Sporus went outside to the gardens. The dew stuck to his bare feet. The olive trees swayed back and forth without a care. He sat on a low stone bench with his fingers wrapped around a small silver ring that Nero had given him as a gift. It was a copy of Poppaea's. He looked at it for a long time. Then he threw it into the grass with a quick flick of his wrist. It made a small noise, not important, just like him. After that, the days were long, soft, quiet, and unremarkable. There were no attendants rushing around him now. No hairstylists curled it. There were no perfumed letters with court summonses. Sporus breathed air that was unscented with fear or incense for the first time since he was a child. He walked through the empty villa barefoot, his fingers brushing against the peeling walls and his ears straining to hear voices that never came. His body still hurt sometimes in the cold mornings, as if it were still there. But being alone brought on a new kind of pain, remembering who he could have been. At night, he would lie in the unused master's bed with his eyes open to the cracked ceiling above. His mind was all over the place. No to Nero, not to the emperors who passed him around like a coin, but to his mom. He couldn't remember her name, but he could still hear her voice. It was soft and fast when she was angry and slow when she sang. He remembered her hands, which were rough from washing clothes by the Tiber. He hadn't seen her since they brought him to the palace. Sporus would never know if she was dead or just didn't know what had happened to her son. He would sometimes whisper into the empty villa as if she could hear him. "I'm still here. Just not me anymore." The guards came back with scrolls from Rome. Vespasian said he was the emperor. They dragged Vitellius through the streets and threw him into the Tiber. The civil war was over, and Rome had crowned a new royal family. They said that order would come back, and with it came an offer. Not from Vespasian, but from Flavia Domitilla, a Roman noblewoman who was the new emperor's niece. She had heard of the legend of Sporus, the ghost bride, and asked him to join her family, not as a mistress, not as a display piece, but as a ward, a visitor. It was a short but strange letter, polite, even nice. Sporus looked at it for hours before answering. As he wrote, the ink ran a little. Flavia's estate was tucked away in the hills of Praenesta, with views of green valleys and quiet orchards. Sporus thought he would find wealth when he got there. Instead, he saw stone walls covered in ivy, dogs running around, and a house full of laughter and talking. Flavia welcomed him in the atrium. She was older than he thought, maybe in her mid-30s, with a sharp face that had softened with age and interest. She didn't wear any makeup, no gems. a tunic with a woven leather belt around it. "I'm sorry for everything that happened to you," she said softly after the servants left. Sporus blinked. "You knew?" "I've heard the stories. I know what parts are not true." He looked down. He whispered, "I don't know what I am." Flavia moved closer. "You just have to be alive." Something inside Sporus started to melt in the months that followed. He woke up with the sun, fed the animals with the help of the servants, and walked through the groves. Flavia left him books to read, like poetry, plays, and histories. She never told him to read them, but one day he did. Ovid's words gave him comfort, and Seneca's stoic lines made him angry. He started writing down his own thoughts on a small wax tablet, which was something he had never thought he needed to do. The villa turned into a peaceful place to stay. For the first time since his castration, Sporus laughed. The kitchen boy was surprised when he did. A real soft laugh. Real, but only for a short time. He stood under the olive trees that night and looked up at the stars. He whispered, "Sabina is dead. Let her stay dead." It took a long time for winter to come to Praeneste. The olive trees lost their leaves in swirls of gold and gray, and the air got that sharp, metallic edge that Roman frost has. There were always fires burning in the villa's hearths. Sporus spent many evenings sitting close to one, his knees pulled up under a woolen shawl, and the flames flickering in his eyes. He had become quieter, but not in the same way as before. Not the empty silence of giving in. This was different, like water that had been still after a storm. The family got used to him being there quickly. People didn't fear or worship him. He was just there. And for the first time in his life, no one was watching him to use him. People were looking at him. Flavia let him be. But sometimes, while they were walking, she would ask questions about him. Not about Nero, the palace, or the horrible show of power he had to deal with. What he believed. What he could remember. What he wanted. He never really knew what to say. "People expect me to be a story," he said softly as they stood on the hills. "An echo of Nero's craziness. A dress with a sad story." "And what do you expect from yourself?" she asked. He looked off into the distance. "I don't know yet." She smiled. "Okay." Sporus went back to his room one morning and found a small package on his bed. There were new clothes inside, simple, modest ones. No silks, no paint, and no veils. A tunic that is the color of ash, a belt made of soft hide, and a short letter. "If you want to, you can wear this, or not. No one here will stop you from making a choice. FD." He sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, just looking at the fabric. Then, slowly, he started to take off the fancy clothes he had worn every day for years. He took off the robes, the jewelry, and the other things that were part of someone else's fantasy one by one. Something changed inside him when he pulled the plain tunic over his head. Not set, not healed yet, but it came back. He stopped that night when he saw one of the bronze mirrors in the hall. The face that looked back at him wasn't Poppaea. It wasn't Sabina. It was a different person. Not thick, pale, exhausted, but true. The villa felt like a different world by the time spring came. Sporus had begun to laugh more often. He talked to the servants. He played with the dogs. He ate until he was full. He slept soundly, not worried about footsteps at night. And he started to write. Not just ideas, but also stories. One was about a boy who lived in a statue. Another one is about a city that made a bird its emperor. There was a strange sadness in each story, but also a spark of defiance, as if he were rewriting his life one line at a time. Flavia found him in the garden one afternoon, with a wax tablet on his knees. She said softly, "You should publish them." "I don't think Rome is ready to hear my stories." "Then write them down for yourself," he nodded. But peace doesn't last forever. A messenger from Rome came one hot, humid morning in the middle of summer. He brought an invitation with him that was formal and full of pomp. Domitian, Vespasian's younger son, was going to get married in front of everyone. It was expected that all noble families would go. Flavia was already getting ready to leave because she was family. Sporus read the scroll once. Again. The words sat in his stomach like lead. That night, she found him on the balcony, staring into the dark. "You don't have to go," she said. "I know. But you do want to." He nodded, slowly. "I think I should." The day they got back to Rome, the city was in full bloom. The arches were topped with garlands of ivy and laurel. The statues were freshly scrubbed, the fountains smelled good, and the forum's great colonnades shone like new marble teeth. But under all the beauty, Sporus could feel the city's heart beating the same way it always had. Loud, watchful, and hungry. As their carriage rolled through the gates, Sporus caught glimpses of the old world, the towering Palatine, where he had once been dressed in silks not his own. The theater where Nero played Orpheus before an audience forced a clap. The paved avenue where he had been paraded as a bride to a corpse. There were ghosts in every part of Rome. Some of them still thought of him. The Palace of Domitian was more like a fortress than a home. It was big, cold, and had a lot of angles. There were guards in every hallway. Senators were buzzing around like bees in a bad hive. Sporus walked through it all with his head held high and still, wrapped in simple linen. This was a big change from the veiled vision he had once been. He was led to a room with tall windows and no personal item, just a chair, a basin, and a scroll of expected behavior. He read it and then burned it in the fire. He would not be a puppet again. The forum was the center of the wedding. There were thousands of people there. The bride, a noblewoman with a pure bloodline, was led in with flowers woven into her hair. Domitian stood in ceremonial armor, smiling like a man who was used to smiling when people were watching. Flavia walked next to Sporus through the marble portico, saying hello to people she knew. He saw people he knew, even though they were older now. Some people looked at him in shock and disbelief. Some people stared and then quickly looked away. And then he saw him. A senator with thin arms and cold steel eyes. He used to be one of Nero's most loyal followers. Sporus remembered how the man had clapped for Nero's craziness just enough to stay alive. The man also knew him. He said something to a friend in a low voice. They laughed too much. Sporus turned his face forward and walked past them without a sound. He sat down near the back, where the cruel light of the show was softened by shadows. Sporus's hands stayed still in his lap as the ceremony went on with chants, vows, and gifts. But his mind was racing. He wasn't really angry, he was finished. Finished being a sign, no more being a prop. No longer being the ghost of someone else's dream. Guests rushed into the banquet halls after the ceremony was over. Every wall sparkled with gold. There was music in the air, the kind that makes you forget about your problems and have fun. Flavia talked to nobles. Sporus walked around. He found a small balcony above the gardens, away from the noise, the wine, and the empty praise. A young servant brought a tray of bread and grapes. Sporus shook his head. "Wait," the servant said, stopping. "You are ... Sporus turned around slowly. Yes, the boy didn't move, no laugh. There was something else in his eyes, wanting to know more. Maybe even ... compassion. He said, "You were married to an emperor." Sporus said, "No, I was used by one." The boy blinked. "Are you ... mad?" Sporus shook his head. "I'm just tired of pretending I was ever a wife." He went back to the night air. That night, when the stars bled across the sky and Rome slept under its marble cloak, Sporus and Flavia went back to the villa. They didn't talk to each other much. They didn't have to. That night, as he lay in bed, he reached under the wooden chest and pulled out the tablet he hadn't used since winter. He wrote a line, then one more, then a whole page. There was no name for the boy in the statue. But when the sculptor broke the stone to let him go, the boy smiled. Not because he was saved, but because he could finally choose his face. Sporus had finished his first full story by the beginning of fall. He tied the wax tablets together with twine and put them under his pillow. He wasn't sure if he was proud or just relieved. It wasn't easy to find the right words. It took hours to write some sentences. Others came out of him like wounds that were opening up again. But when he finally pressed the last word into the wax, something in his chest let go, like a bird that had been in a cage for a long time stopped clawing at the bars. Flavia saw the change in him before he said anything. One morning, over figs and barley bread, she said, "You sleep better." "I write until I can't sleep anymore." "Good. Dreams in this city aren't often nice." Sporus didn't smile, but his eyes got softer. She put her hand over his across the table. "You should put it out there." He opened his mouth. Then it closed again. He had thought about this moment. Someone reading his story, knowing the truth, and feeling that sharp edge of pain mixed with defiance. But putting it out there? In Rome? A city made of masks? He asked quietly, "What name should I use? Sabina? Sporus? Neither of them are real." Flavia smiled a little, sadly. "Then pick a new one." It took a long time. He walked through the rows of trees in the orchard. He drew his shadow on the walls of the villa. He sat next to the dry fountain and said out loud all the names people had ever called him. Boy, bride, whore, empress, and ornament. None of them were his. In the end, he didn't choose a name that was famous, royal, or from a myth. He picked a name that wasn't loud. Something a mother might say to her baby. One he had never heard before in a palace. One that made him feel like a person. No one knew who wrote the scroll. No one noticed at first. People in Rome were too busy with politics, games, and rumors about Flavian rule. The book, which was only 20 pages long, was called The Sculptor's Boy, but it spread slowly. Senators passed it around to each other with confused whispers. Slaves wrote it down by candlelight. A lady of the nobility sent it to her sister in Hispania. In Alexandria, a Greek philosopher read it out loud. One soldier carved a line from it into his shield. The story was strange. It was part fable and part memory. A boy who was carved into someone else's shape, and then broken to find his own shape again. It was a mystery who wrote it. But they all felt it. Months went by. Rome did what it always did. It turned, changed, and forgot. There were new scandals. There were new statues put up. After his brother died, Domitian took over and ruled with a colder hand than anyone had thought. Sporus kept on writing. There were more stories after that. Some are very sad. Others are smart and sharp. He wrote about a girl who turned into a crow to get away from her wedding. A boy who sang songs that made layers' tongues turn to ash. About a marble empress who broke herself open to let the child out. He never said he was famous. But in every part of Rome, someone read his words and understood that this was not just a story. It was to stay alive. 5 years later, Flavia passed away in her sleep. Sporus stayed by her bed until dawn. He cried without feeling bad about it, then buried her under a cypress tree that looked out over the valley. He carved a line into her stone himself, taken from the first story she ever told him to write. She gave him no crown, no sword, no altar, just room to grow. The name Sporus was forgotten over time. People told children stories about Nero that were meant to teach them a lesson. The ghost bride's whispers became a legend. And the real story, one that was carved in silence, written in pain, and born in freedom, stayed in quiet scrolls that were passed from person to person long after Rome fell. No one could remember what he looked like, but they remembered the boy without a name, until he gave himself one.